The agenda, up first we're going to be talking about the regulatory background. Then we're going to go through an ERP versus EAP comparison. And then we're going to touch on the ERP and EAP requirements separately in a little bit more detail as far as what the regulations require. And then we're going to discuss the conclusions from this presentation and summarize what the main key thought is that you should take away from today. Some key objectives is to understand key differences between ERP and EAP, understand key regulatory requirements regarding emergency response and action plans, and understand appropriate applications and implementation of an ERP or EAP. So getting started on the regulatory background, first we're going to talk about why you need to have an emergency response plan. What led up to the requirement. Basically, there's a long list of accidents that have happened in industry. This is just a select list, but it led to the development of the CCPS and industry regulations, as well as federal and state regulations to regulate process facilities in terms of their safety requirements. So you have RMP and PSM, and as part of these programs, you're required to have an emergency response element. And deciding whether or not you need to have a full plan or an emergency action plan is kind of what we're going to be going over today. So some observations from these major incidents is that there was a lack of communication, an inability to properly execute emergency response, and lack of preparation, inadequate procedures or training, lack of proper equipment or equipment interoperability, out-of-date contact information, or lack of coordination with emergency response groups, so your fire department or your hazmat. There are multiple planning requirements out there. For the local governments, you have area plans, disaster or general response plans, hazard mitigation plans. There's also hazardous materials area plans, which tie the local government with the hazmat facilities. But for specific facilities, depending on what type of facility you are, you have regulations by the EPA, the Coast Guard, OSHA, quite a few different regulations. Summary is actually on the next slide. So you have the National Incident Management System and Standardized Emergency Management System, which is a California requirement. You have the EPA Oil Pollution Prevention Program, pipeline response plans, facility response plans. You have the RMP and PSM that I talked about earlier. And OSHA has some additional emergency response requirements that they outline as well. So ERP versus EAP. Some key differences. An ERP is used usually if the facility is a first responder or they're going to take offensive action to mitigate the release. And an EAP is usually used if you're a non-responding facility and you only take defensive actions. A typical agency chooses to be a responding facility if there's a specific reason why they need to be able to respond in a timely manner, or if the resources are not adequate of the local fire department, or there may be some other additional reasons regarding the hazards of the process that they are using as well. A first responder is somebody that plans to act upon a release with the intention of stopping and containing the hazardous materials from the environment. You have to report it to the local authority as soon as possible, but you maintain a full emergency response plan and you ensure that the procedures can be initiated when required in the facility, which requires having training and equipment that is up to date. Non-first responders, you basically plan to evacuate the facility in an orderly manner using evacuation procedures, and this is something that you need to have in place ahead of time as well. You report to the local authority to have emergency responders actually come to your facility and mitigate the release, and then you maintain your emergency action plan that supports emergency responders. So it's not as detailed as an emergency response plan. Your primary objective is basically to optimize protection for plant personnel, the community, and the environment. So a lot of times the balance between plant personnel and municipal emergency responders can actually be a good mix, because you know your facility and you know how to mitigate the release, and the emergency responders are trained to be in the hazardous environment. So a lot of pre-planning and training can actually help to facilitate that response in a timely manner. Also, facility characteristics and resources versus fire department resources could be a key variable in determining whether or not you're going to be a first responder or be a non-responder. In a lot of cases, then unoptimal response involves both parties. So you'll have your municipal emergency responders, and you'll also have plant personnel to assist them. And a predetermined, agreed-upon roles increase effectiveness. This is typically achieved through doing site walkdowns with your municipal responders, as well as training and tabletops and things like that, so they're familiar with what needs to happen if you have a release. So applications for ERP. If the facility is in a remote location or the municipal emergency response organization does not have the ability to provide a timely or effective response, you typically maintain an emergency response plan with some basic personnel and response capabilities to make sure that you're able to mitigate a release without having harm to the public or to your own employees. And you have to maintain these in a ready state. You need to have your training and fit testing and a lot of different elements in terms of keeping things on site and doing preparation and drills and communicating with your employees. Make sure that if you do have a release, they are trained to respond, and they will also be able to document what needs to happen as well. For this facility, keeping the emergency response plan appropriately updated and personnel trained is critical. Applications for the EAP. If the facility is in a heavily populated area with a community able to provide rapid access and effective emergency response resources, they have a trained hazmat team. A lot of people will implement an emergency action plan and not take on the liability of having their employees respond and keeping up to date with all of the training and equipment that they need to have on site if their municipal responders are able to handle that. So if you are going to implement an EAP, typically it's a good idea to do the familiarization with the municipal responders, invite them out for walkdowns, introduce them to your personnel, and conduct training. Show them where the emergency stop is or the isolation valves and things like that. Discuss the hazards with municipal emergency responders. If they don't understand the process and what the particular hazards are, they are not going to put their personnel in harm's way as well. So it's a good idea to make sure that you've discussed, what the effective response would be if you were to have different release scenarios. And provide training and install signage that provide the emergency responder guidance to take basic actions to shut down or isolate the system. So this could be appropriate labeling in your system. This is my isolation valve, or this is my emergency shutdown. Different things like that that can help them to facilitate the response. Okay, next we're going to be talking about the ERP requirements as it relates to OSHA. Basically, you need to have pre-emergency planning and coordination with outside parties. You need to define your personnel roles, lines of authority, training, and communication. You need to have emergency recognition and prevention, so different scenarios and how you can mitigate those scenarios. Safe distances and places of refuge. You should have emergency windstocks and evacuation routes and muster areas. And you also need to have a way to account for personnel after you've conducted an evacuation, so some sort of a log or a call-out system. You need to have site security and control. You need to consider this in your plan. So how are you going to keep people from entering into the circle of hazard or your hazardous area? How are you going to block off access and make sure that people are not in an area where they may be harmed? Evacuation routes and procedures. So this is designating your particular areas where you want people to meet. A lot of times people will have two different staging areas depending upon whether they have a prevailing wind direction. So you may have several different areas that you need to consider, which is why you want to give guidance on identifying the best location based on the wind direction. Decontamination. So if you're going to be responding, you need to have a decontamination element to your emergency response plan. Emergency medical treatment and first aid. You need to talk about what the hazards are associated with the chemicals that you have on site and what to do if somebody is exposed to those chemicals, what type of medical treatment or first aid that needs to be applied. Emergency alerting and response procedures. So how are you going to find out about the release or the emergency, and what are the particular responses for each different type of emergency that you could have? And you need to have an element for critique and response follow-up. So basically lessons learned. Each time you have an incident, you want to make sure that you're able to incorporate those lessons learned back into your emergency response plan. You also need to list out the PPE and emergency equipment that you need to have on site to respond to these emergencies and how to use it. And it also includes training your personnel in those as well. Your emergency response structure. So facilities should be consistent with the National Incident Management System. This is it's called NIMS, and this is a state or a federal requirement that was implemented after 9/11. And it's an overall system to respond to emergencies and prepare for them that has been implemented at the federal, state, and local municipal level, as well as with non-governmental organizations such as chemical facilities or people that have hazards. So it is a system that is intended to integrate at all levels and scale up or down, so you're actually able to work with the municipal responders and talk the same language, which can be quite important in an emergency when things are happening very quickly. It's important to have that type of interoperability. NIMS compliance components include NIMS training, which has an incident command system element. So you need to basically be using the incident command system, or ICS, and conducting training on that system as well. The incident command system is a standardized on-scene all-hazard incident management concept. And on the following slide, I have the actual structure. This is a general ICS structure. You would have your incident commander at the top. You have an operations section, a planning and intelligence section, logistics section, and a finance administration section. And each of these sections have different roles in an emergency that actually are analogous with the fire department or other agencies who would be responding with you. So you can have an operations section chief, and the fire department has an operations section chief, and they can team up and discuss the operations of the emergency. So it's just meant to be an overall structure so that you're using the same titles as everybody else who's going to be involved in the response. ICS features, as I mentioned before, the common terminology. It's important to have everybody speaking the same language when it comes to the emergency, because you'll have police, you'll have fire, you may have your health organization as well, and then you'll have your responders as well if you are going to have a emergency response plan and be first responders. You have a consistent organizational structure. As I showed you on the previous slide, the incident command system is structured such that you are able to activate the portions that you need, but each agency will be following that same general structure. You have consistent position titles. It goes along with the consistent org structure. Integrated communications, common incident facilities. Modular organization. As I mentioned, you can activate certain elements of the incident command system, only the ones that you need, so it's scalable or it's modular in that way. A unified command structure. This is basically where you would be in a unified command with the fire department, so making joint decisions. It's something that you usually need to set up ahead of time, otherwise the fire department will typically take the lead. But it's something that is available as part of the incident command structure. Consolidated action plans and manageable span of control. So typically the manageable span of control is 3 to 5 personnel beneath you. When you get above that, you need to start expanding and have additional leads or sections as well. So you have a manageable span of control and comprehensive resource management. So you'll have your logistics section will be tracking what equipment is deployed where and how it's being used, including staff and equipment. And scalability, you can scale up or scale down depending on how large the emergency is. Some training that's important to note for emergency responders. You have the first responder awareness level. This is trained to initiate an emergency response by notifying the proper authorities. You have first responder operations level. So this is trained to respond in a defensive fashion without trying to stop the release. You contain the release from a safe distance, keep it from spreading, and prevent exposures. This is 8 hours of training. This is basic hazards, proper PPE, and operating procedures. First responder, hazardous materials technician level. This is to respond to a release with the intention of stopping that release. And this is 24 hours of training, of which 8 are equivalent to the operations level. You also have first responder, hazardous materials specialist. You provide support to the hazardous materials technician. You liaison with federal, state, and local and other government authorities. And you have 24 hours of training equal to the technician. The incident commander or on-scene manager, you're going to be assuming the control of the incident beyond the first responder. And you have 24 hours of training equal to the first responder. And you have the ICS and ERP implementation responsibility. There's also the incident command system training. This is an overview of how to implement the incident command system and what the different roles and responsibilities are. You also have tabletops, drills, and exercises. These are a great way to actually plan ahead and work through some mock release scenarios, either in a brainstorming session or actually deploying resources and mock responding within the field. This is a great way to actually coordinate with the actual municipal responders, and you can work through the scenarios to get them familiar with how a response would occur at your facility. Okay, and a little bit of an overview on emergency response equipment. This list is not comprehensive, but things that you need to consider are emergency response equipment such as fire extinguishers or spill kits, PPE, SCBAs, different response gear. Communications, having radios and testing as well. Emergency alarm systems, audible and visual. Safety systems, you may have a deluge system, emergency shutdowns, scrubber systems, things of that nature. But one of the things to really consider when you're talking about equipment that's used in an emergency response function is testing and calibrating and making sure that it's all up to date, because you need to ensure that that equipment is reliable and can be used in an emergency in a ready state. So you just grab it and go. You don't have to worry about sorting through whether or not certain pieces of equipment are available. Okay, the next section that we're going to talk about is emergency action plan requirements. The objective is to identify designated actions employers and employees must take to ensure employee safety from fire and other emergencies. So in this case, we would also be talking about a hazardous materials release or spill. Specific requirements include emergency escape procedures and emergency escape route assignments. This would be your evacuation, upwind and uphill. Make sure you get away from the area that can be impacted by a release. Procedures to be followed by employees who remain to operate critical plant operations before they evacuate. Basically, you need to make sure that you are protecting your employees who are going to be affecting the emergency shutdowns, if that's a way that if they're able to do that from a safe location. Procedures to account for all employees after emergency evacuation has been completed. You need to have a log sheet or a call-out system in order to assure that everybody that's on site is accounted for after the emergency or evacuation. You need to document rescue and medical duties for those employees who are to perform them. It's important to note that you must have proper training and PPE and are not going to become part of the problem or part of the hazard. So make sure that if you are going to be assigning those duties, it's clearly defined who is able to perform them and what training they must have in order to conduct that sort of rescue or medical attention. The preferred means of reporting fires and other emergencies. So this includes in the plant, how to notify the employees and conduct the evacuation, as well as your local authorities. So how are you going to be notifying the fire department, and who's going to have that responsibility? Legal requirements for reporting. Depending on what chemicals you have on site, there are certain thresholds for releases that you need to report, and you need to make sure that you have that documented so that you're doing it in a timely manner and you don't incur any sort of additional fines or citations based upon your reporting. You also need to talk about names or regular job titles of persons or departments who can be contacted for further information or explanation of duties under the plan. Fairly self-explanatory. You need to have a way for employees to get more information if they need it or do not feel comfortable with your emergency action plan. You need to have an establishment of an employee alarm system. Okay, and next, evacuation. We've talked about this a little bit before. So the employer shall establish in the emergency action plan the types of evacuation to be used in emergency circumstances. So employees should be trained to evacuate upwind and uphill. Find the windsock and find the muster location. A lot of times employers will actually provide signage in the vicinity of the evacuation areas or document that in a way that it's easy to find so people know where to go. And training is actually a great way to make sure that people know how to respond in an evacuation. So doing mock fire drills or release drills, getting people used to evacuating and mustering and doing the roll call is really important. Training, so the employer shall review with each employee upon initial assignment those parts of the plan which the employee must know to protect the employee in the event of an emergency. So providing a general level of training and awareness for the emergency action plan and what their response or roles would be in that emergency and how to implement them. This should be done initially when the plan is developed or whenever the employee's responsibilities or designations under the plan change or whenever the plan is changed. So those are the types of changes or circumstances that would require additional training. In conclusion, each facility must periodically validate the best EAP or ERP option, balancing the following: municipal emergency response, hazmat team availability. Do you need to be a first responder? Are the municipal responders able to actually effectively respond to your emergencies, or are you in a rural location where you would not have the response available to you? You have a responsibility to protect personnel, community, and the environment. So if the response would not be effective or timely, you would want to consider having a full emergency response plan and taking the offensive action if you were to have a release. And you also need to balance emergency preparedness program costs, keeping your plans up to date, resource maintenance, your testing and calibration of your equipment, and also training and emergency drills, and just the general resources that need to be applied in order to keep an emergency response program effective. Okay. Does anybody have any questions?
This is Solveig Sæther, the webcast producer, and if you have any questions, please go to the top of your screen where it says Viewing RMP Corp's Applications, and pull that down and you'll see a chat option. You can send me a message there to RMP Corp, and I will relay your questions to Kristin.
Are we getting any questions?
We have a question as to whether we can get the participants can get a copy of the PowerPoint presentation. That will be emailed to you shortly after we conclude.
And I should note that I'm also available by email if you have any more specific questions that you don't want to ask in the webcast forum. If you have anything that applies directly to your facility, feel free to email me or give me a call, and we can discuss that application.
When responding to a leak of flammable material that is still in the ppm range and has not reached 10% LEL, would this fall under .120?
In terms of whether or not you're a responder or not, it sort of depends on the case, whether or not it would be an incidental release or an accidental release. So it's really at the judgment of the facility in that case. Incidental releases, you are able to respond or mitigate.
Okay, next question. Can you recommend guidance on steps to be taken in support of emergency response personnel?
Well, there's a lot of different guidance out there depending on what type of facility you have and what this particular parameters are. So if you want to give me an email and let me know what type of facility that you have, I can recommend some guidance documents out there.
Okay, one more question. Can we respond to minor releases with just an EAP?
No. Well, I mean, my guidance to you would be no. You want to make sure that you have proper training to respond to releases. Again, there are certain exemptions, or not exemptions, but if it is an incidental release or it's something that you're able to mitigate before, like a puff or something along those lines, that would not be considered a response. But if you are going to be taking any sort of offensive action, that is considered an emergency response. Okay. And again, if anybody has any additional questions, feel free to give me an email and I can help to point you in the right direction. So, all right. Thank you very much.